Thank you for being with me this morning. This is the very, very final chapter. It says the gentle art syntonics system of verbal self-defense. An overview. Just as there is a grammar of English for such things as the tenses of verbs and the order of words in sentences, there is a grammar of English for verbal violence and verbal self-defense. All native speakers of English know this grammar flawlessly, although many factors, such as stress, nervousness, illness, lack of time, and the like, can interfere with their demonstration of that flawless knowledge. The problem is that the information is not available at a level of conscious awareness, and people cannot therefore conveniently make use of it. The syntonic system of verbal self-defense is designed to correct this problem. When you use this system, you will not be restricted to sarcastic comebacks and counterattacks for use in verbal confrontations. Instead, you will be able to create for yourself a language environment in which such confrontations will be very rare. Furthermore, when they do occur, you will be able to deal with them quickly and competently, with no sacrifice of your own self-respect and no loss of face on either side of the interaction. This section contains a brief overview of the basic principles of the system, together with 3 examples of techniques for putting it to use. You will find many more detailed examples of these and other techniques throughout this book. This section is for your reference and your review. Reference items. The 4 basic principles. 1. Know that you are under attack. 2. Know what kind of attack you are facing. 3. Know how to make your defense fit the attack. 4. Know how to follow through. The first principle is important. Most verbal victims are unaware that they are victims. Typically, they feel miserable, but they don't know why, and they tend to blame not those who abuse them, but themselves. The second and third principles work together to help you tailor your responses. When you learn to recognize language modes, like the sensory and the satire modes described below, and to construct responses based on rules for their use, you are applying these 2 principles. The 4th principle is often the hardest. There are 2 barriers to its implementation. 1, the idea that if you don't participate in the power game of verbal abuse, you are letting the abuser get away with it. And 2, the problem of feeling guilty about defending yourself, especially common among women. The next one is Miller's Law. In order to understand what another person is saying, you must assume that it is true and try to imagine what it could be true of. By George Miller from 1980. Elgin's Corollary. In order for other people to understand what you are saying, you must make it possible for them to apply Miller's Law to your language. Syntonics. Syntonics in the gentle art system is the science of language harmony. The name is taken from the term syntonic, used in radio telegraphy to describe 2 radio sets sufficiently well tuned to one another to allow the efficient and effective transmission of information. When people attempt to communicate with each other, they need to try for a similar syntonic state. Presupposition. A presupposition is anything that a native speaker of a language knows is part of the meaning of a sequence of that language, even if it does not appear on the surface of the sequence. For example, every native speaker of English knows that the meaning of the sentence, "Even John could pass that course," includes two more. That the class is somehow second rate, and so is John. The sentence means, even John, who, as everybody knows, is no great shakes as a student, could pass that course, which, as everybody knows, is a really trivial class. But the negative comments about John and the course are not there in the surface structure of the sentence. They are presupposed. Most verbal attacks, with the exception of the very crudest ones, are at least partly hidden away in presuppositions. Next area, first technique, using the sensory modes. Human beings can't survive without information. We need information from the outside environment and from our bodies. We need that information for other human beings and living creatures, from other human beings and living creatures. And we need a system for managing all this data, or it would be impossible to deal with. Information that's coming in has to be processed. It must be selected and understood, and then either discarded or indexed for storage in memory. Information going out has to be processed also, so that it can be expressed for other people to understand. Our primary mechanism for this processing is the set of sensory systems: sight and hearing and touch, taste and smell, etc. Each of us has a preferred sensory system that we find easiest to use, and that helps us the most in understanding and remembering. And when we express ourselves, we often demonstrate that preference by using one of the language behavior modes called sensory modes, like this. Sight. I really like the way this looks. Hearing. This just sounds great to me. Touch. I don't feel right about this. Smell. This whole plan smells fishy to me. Taste. This leaves an awful taste in my mouth. People who hear you matching their preferred sensory modes are more likely to trust you and to listen to what you say. They think of you as someone who speaks their language and shares their perceptions. This is the easiest of all the gentle art techniques, and is one that you can put to use immediately. Under normal circumstances, people can switch from one sensory mode to another without any difficulty. But when they're under stress, they tend to get locked into their preferred mode. The more upset they are, the more trouble they will have understanding communication in other sensory modes, and the more trouble they will have using other sensory modes to express themselves. In such situations, you will improve communication drastically if you match the sensory mode they are using. You'll have no trouble identifying the sensory mode coming at you because you are a fluent speaker of English. You will do this automatically. You can then tailor your own response for maximum efficiency and effectiveness by following these two simple rules. Rule 1, match the sensory mode coming at you. Rule 2, if you can't follow Rule 1, use no sensory mode language at all. The second technique. Using the Satir modes. Dr. Virginia Satir was a world-famous family therapist. As she worked with clients, she noticed that the language behavior of people under stress tends to fall into one of the following 5 categories. The Satir modes. S-A-T-I-R. So it could be something else, but I've been calling it Satir the whole time, so we're going to stick with that. First one is blaming. Why don't you ever think about anybody else's feelings? Don't you even care about others? Placating. Oh, you know how I am. Shoot. Whatever you want to do is okay with me. Computing. There is undoubtedly a good reason for this delay. No sensible person would be upset about it. Distracting. What is the matter with you anyway? Not that I care. You know me. I can put up with anything. However, common sense would indicate that the original rules should be followed. And leveling. I like you, but I don't like your methods. Each of the satire modes has a characteristic style of body language. Blamers shake their fist or their index finger. They scowl and frown and loom over people. Placators cling and fidget and lean on others. Computers are stiff and rigid, moving as little as possible. Distractors cycle through the other modes with their bodies just as they do with their words. The body language of levelers is distinguished by the absence of these other patterns and by the fact that it is not in conflict with their words. The first four modes are examples of the lack of a personal syntonic state. People use blamer mode because they are insecure and afraid that nobody will respect or obey them. They use placator mode, saying that they don't care because they care so much. They use computer mode, saying I have no emotions, because they are afraid of the emotions they actually feel and afraid to let them show. Distractor mode cycles through all of these states of mismatch and expresses panic. Only with leveler mode do you have a syntonic state, to the extent that they are capable of accurately judging their own feelings. People using leveler mode use words and body language that match those feelings. As with the sensory modes, people can ordinarily switch from one satire mode to the other, but tend to become locked into a preferred satire mode in situations of tension and stress. The rules for using the satire modes are based on the same meta principle as those for using sensory modes. Anything you feed will grow. When you match a language pattern coming at you, you feed it, and it escalates. The difference between the two techniques is that it's always a good thing to match another person's sensory mode, because increasing the level of trust and rapport is always a good thing. But you should only match the satire mode if you want to feed that pattern. Here are the results you can count on. Blaming at a blamer causes fights and scenes. Placating at a placator causes undignified delay. Computing at a computer causes dignified delay. Distracting at a distractor is panic feeding panic. And leveling at a leveler means an exchange of the simple truth going both ways. In any language interaction, once you've recognized the satire mode coming at you, you have to choose your response. You make your choice based on the situation, on what you know about the other person, and on your own communication goals. Here are the two rules you need. Rule 1, if you don't know what to do, use computer mode. Rule 2, if it would be desirable to have the satire mode coming at you escalate, match that mode. The next section. The third technique. recognizing and responding to the verbal attack patterns of English. Many people don't realize that they are verbal victims because the verbal abuse they are subjected to is not openly abusive. Most verbal abusers don't just spit out curses and insults. Instead, they use verbal attack patterns, VAPS, that are part of the grammar of English verbal violence. These patterns are just as dangerous as shouted obscenities, but much more subtle. The attack pattern discussed below have two parts. There is the bait, which the attacker expects you to respond to. It's easy to recognize because it's the part that hurts. And then there is the attack that matters, which is usually hidden away in the form of one or more presuppositions. Here's an example. If you really loved me, you wouldn't waste money the way you do. The bait is the part about wasting money. That is what the attacker expects you to respond to. You are expected to take the bait and say, "What do you mean? I waste money? I do not." And then you are off to a flaming row. Not a good way to handle the situation. The important part of the attack is not the bait, but the presupposition at the beginning. You don't really love me. Instead of taking the bait, respond directly to that presupposed attack. Say, "When did you start thinking that I don't really love you?" Or, "Of course I love you." This is not what the attacker expects, and it will short-circuit the confrontation. Here are some other examples of English verbal attack patterns. You will find more information about them throughout the book, together with suggested responses. Here's some examples. "If you really wanted me to get good grades, you'd buy me a computer like all the other kids have got." Next one. "A person who really cared about his health wouldn't want to smoke." Next one. "Don't you even care if the neighbors are all laughing at us?" The next one. "Even a woman your age should be able to cook a decent lunch." Next one. "Everybody understands why you're so touchy, you know." Next one. "Why don't you ever listen to me when I talk to you?" Next one. "Some people would be furious if they had to put up with an employee who never did her share of the work." Next one. "You know I'd never tell you how to run your life, but don't marry that woman." Next one. "You're not the only person around here who has problems, you know." Next one. "Even if you do forget my birthday again, I'll still love you." And the final one. "You could at least get to work on time." It is important to realize that what makes these examples attacks is not the words they contain. For English, more than half of the information is not in the words, but in the body language, including the intonation of the voice. To recognize a verbal attack, you have to pay attention to the intonation, the melody of the voice that goes with the words. Anytime you hear a lot of extra stresses and emphasis on words or parts of words, you should be on alert. There is no more important cue to recognizing verbal attacks than abnormal stress patterns. The sentence, "Why do you eat so much junk food?" may be very rude and unkind, but it is not a verbal attack. The attack that goes with those words sounds like this: Why do you eat so much junk food? In dealing with verbal attack patterns, you have 3 rules to follow. Here they are. Rule 1, ignore the bait. Rule 2, respond directly to the attack hidden in the presuppositions. Rule 3, no matter what else you do, say something that transmits this message. Don't try that with me. I won't play that game. Nobody can carry on a verbal attack alone. It takes 2 people, one to be the attacker and one to be the victim. People who use verbal abuse do so because they want the fight or the scene, and they value the havoc they create. When you take the bait in their attacks and go along with their plans, you aren't showing them how strong and assertive you are. You are giving them exactly what they want. And the more you do that, the worse the situation will get. Every time you take the bait in a verbal attack, you are participating in a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Instead of doing that, use this technique and break out of the loop. And that was all. This has been Success with the Gentle Art of Verbal Self-Defense by Suzette Hayden Elgin. Thank you for letting me read it to you. I've had this book for, I don't even know, a long, long, long time. And I've used it over the years repeatedly, different sections, different problems. And it's always given me just ideas that I just didn't have. If you know me personally, you know that I grew up in Mexico. So spending years in another country where language, and I did not know any Spanish when I got there. So learning to stumble through and practice, and this is a this and this is a that, and learn another person's language. So I think that my value on the abilities that you can have by using your language best, and English is used across this world. Getting better at any kind of English is going to help in a lot of different ways. But when I've tried to talk to people over the years about some of the stuff I've learned out of these books I've been reading, y'all, it's hard to understand. You kind of need to hear the book or maybe the paragraph, and I don't always explain it the way that I read it. So I am very thankful that you've hung with me for this book. I know that it was very long and it could seem complicated, but I'm excited that you can just rewind something or replay it, and I hope that it helps. I've gotten a lot of stuff out of this book, The Gentle Art. It's not foolproof, and it's not the only way, but I'm very thankful. I appreciate you listening to me read to you. I really enjoy it. So I'm sorry we did not catch the full sunrise today, but some beautiful fog, and so to sit here for a second and you can hear some of those waves on the water. It is a beautiful morning. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for your time.